lady at Harvard stopped at a blackboard with an equation on it. A minute later, the entire university froze. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Harvard Yard was still cloaked in silence, the darkness folding itself around the ancient brick buildings like a shawl. The chill of dawn crept between the columns and stone archways, curling into the empty corridors where the echo of footsteps would soon begin again with the day's awakening. But for now, it was still, a sacred hour, known only to the ghosts of the past and the few who served the institution long before the scholars arrived. Rosa Lee Walker moved slowly down the corridor of the Maxwell building, pushing her cleaning cart in front of her. Her steps were steady, her posture slightly stooped, not from weakness, but from years of labor that had carved quiet strength into her back. Her uniform was simple: gray slacks, a matching work shirt with facilities services stitched over the left pocket, and a pair of old sneakers that had long since lost their whiteness. Her tightly coiled silver hair was tucked under a navy scarf, tied neatly at the nape of her neck. In one hand, she gripped the mop handle, in the other, the keys that jingled softly with each step. Her face was calm, unreadable, but her eyes, dark and deep, glinted with awareness. They missed nothing, even if no one thought to meet them. This was Rosa's domain. Not the classrooms, not the podiums or plaques that bore the names of great donors and laureates, but the spaces in between, the scuffed floors, the forgotten hallways, the quiet before the storm. She cleaned without complaint, spoke only when spoken to, and kept her head down, not because she was afraid, but because she knew too well that when a black woman of 74 raises her voice in places like this, it's rarely welcomed. For 12 years, Rosa had arrived at Harvard before sunrise. She had no accolades on the walls, no lectures named after her. Students didn't know her name. Professors barely noticed her. If they did, it was with the kind of dismissive courtesy afforded to someone folding napkins at a gala or pouring coffee into bone-white cups. Occasionally, a freshman would nod as he passed her with headphones on, mouthing the words of a podcast. Once in a while, a foreign student might give a soft smile, but most simply looked through her, like glass, like silence. On this particular morning, Rosa was scrubbing down the floors outside Lecture Hall 203 when the door opened and a young security officer greeted her with a brisk, "Mornin', Miss Walker." She nodded politely, not stopping her work. She rarely spoke during her shift, not because she couldn't, but because her Southern English, shaped by decades of Louisiana heat and Mississippi church pews, seemed to land awkwardly in this clipped, formal world. And besides, she had learned that silence often made others more comfortable. Behind the thick wooden doors of Lecture Hall 203, rows of polished desks stretched beneath high windows, and a massive chalkboard loomed at the front, scrawled with symbols from yesterday's graduate-level course. Rosa pushed the doors open gently, her cart rattling against the threshold, and rolled inside. She took her time, dusting each desk, aligning each chair. Her hands moved with habitual precision, like a pianist warming up before a recital. As she approached the board, her eyes scanned the long string of equations left from Professor Benton's lecture. Differential equations, partial derivatives, boundary conditions. She recognized them instantly, though it had been nearly 4 decades since she'd last stood in front of a chalkboard with her own name on the course schedule. A breath caught in her throat. Professor Harold Benton was a fixture at Harvard, white, sharp-jawed, and well-dressed, with a salt-and-pepper beard and a voice trained to command. He had won teaching awards, published widely, and built a reputation for brilliance paired with brutality. Students feared his classes, but his recommendation letters were golden tickets to elite graduate programs. He ran his lectures like symphonies, uninterrupted, demanding, and precise. Later that morning, Benton would walk into this very room and deliver another dense lecture, dissecting the mathematical landscape as though it were a battlefield and he the general. Rosa had cleaned this room before every one of those lectures for over a decade. She had heard pieces through the doors, proofs, theorems, and historical anecdotes of mathematicians whose names she had once recited with admiration. She never lingered. She never interfered. But that morning, as she erased the board and stared at the final unsolved equation at the bottom right corner, a particularly thorny PDE, something stirred in her. It looked familiar. Too familiar. She stood still for a moment, the chalkboard eraser hanging loosely in her hand. Her eyes traced the symbols, dancing over them like fingertips over braille. She could feel her mind reconnecting with a world she had locked away long ago. Her lips parted slightly, barely audible words slipping out. Overdetermined system. Non-homogeneous boundary. She stopped herself, blinked slowly, and exhaled. No one heard her. No one ever did. She shook her head, wiped the last equation clean, and returned to her cart. That same afternoon, Professor Benton strode into Lecture Hall 203 with his usual authority. The room filled quickly with students. The air buzzed with anxiety as notebooks opened and laptops flicked to life. He greeted them with a clipped nod and turned to the board. "Today," he said, chalk in hand, "we discuss the limitations of analytic solutions in non-linear boundary problems." He wrote swiftly, the chalk squeaking under pressure. The board filled with a complex equation, the variables nested, the conditions strict. "This one," he said, stepping back, "is unlikely any of you will solve. Not this semester, not without serious effort." As he spoke, Rosa re-entered the room with her mop and bucket, quietly wiping the back of the lecture hall as she did every Tuesday afternoon. She moved silently, respectfully, barely breathing, but she was there. Professor Benton paused, turning slightly to glance toward the back of the room. His eyes landed on her. "This," he said, now with a touch of showmanship, "is why we study, so we don't end up cleaning classrooms for a living." There was a beat of silence, then laughter, light at first, then bolder. Rosa's mop froze mid-swipe. Her back stiffened, but she did not turn. She finished the row she was on, turned her bucket quietly, and continued to the next. The professor grinned. "Math requires discipline, sacrifice. Not everyone is built for it." The students laughed again. A few shifted awkwardly. Some glanced back at the old woman, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps curiosity. Rosa did not meet their gaze. She never did. She finished the last row and wheeled her bucket to the door. Her hands trembled slightly. She felt the burn in her cheeks, the sting behind her eyes, but no tear fell. Not yet. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. She looked up at the ceiling, her lips pressed tight. That man had no idea. Decades earlier, she had stood in front of rooms just like that one. She had been applauded for her paper on Fourier transformations in inhomogeneous media. Her doctoral advisor once told her she could shape the future of numerical analysis. But one decision had altered everything. One ring on her finger, one mother slipping into dementia, one man who needed care. The academy had no room for caretakers, no tolerance for long absences, no sympathy for the help. She had faded. She returned to her cleaning route. Outside, snow began to fall in flurries. Students passed her in heavy coats, laughing into their phones. She pushed her cart towards the next building, her steps steady, her eyes quiet. But her mind had already returned to that equation, and it refused to let go. The next day dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter morning that painted frost across the windows and made every footstep echo sharper in the empty halls. Rosa was, as always, the first to arrive. Her gloved fingers fumbled briefly with the keys before she unlocked the double doors to Maxwell Hall. The building was quiet. Too quiet. Even the old radiators hadn't begun their metallic groaning yet. She wheeled her cart past the janitor's closet and down toward Lecture Hall 203, pausing only when she reached the familiar threshold. The lights inside were dim, and her reflection stared back at her from the long glass window in the door. She adjusted her scarf, as if bracing for something unseen, then pushed the door open. The board from yesterday had been erased, by her own hand, but the memory of the equation still lingered in her mind like a melody unresolved. She began her routine, dusting, aligning, cleaning, wiping. But her thoughts weren't where her hands were. Her thoughts were on the variables, on the curvature of the integrals, on the patterns that bloomed in her head like old vines coming back to life after a long winter. Her hands moved automatically, and by the time the sun began to slip fingers of light through the upper windows, the room was spotless again. She stood for a moment at the edge of the platform, gazing at the board. That equation was still there, if only in her memory, and it itched. It itched like the way an old wound did when it rained. Later that morning, students trickled in, jackets unzipped, coffees in hand, the scent of espresso and library paper wafting with them. Some glanced at the board, some took seats without looking. Then came Professor Benton, punctual as ever, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor. He strode to the board with the confidence of a man who had nothing to prove and wrote a new equation. "This," he announced, "is for the truly brave among you." He didn't elaborate, just wrote it out, each symbol pressed with firm, deliberate chalk strokes, filling the board with something far more complex than what they'd seen the day before. When he stepped back, the board glowed with an impossible challenge. Partial differential equations layered over nonlinear systems with floating boundary variables and integrals stacked like architectural supports. "I'm posting a little contest," he said, turning to the class. "Solve this, and I'll give you automatic A credit for the course, plus a recommendation letter that will open any door." There were murmurs, some skeptical laughter. "You have until next week," Benton added. "The board stays until someone proves they deserve the reward." A few brave students snapped photos with their phones. Others already looked defeated. What no one noticed was that Rosa, once again, had been in the back, quietly mopping near the rear doors. She heard every word. That evening, after the building had emptied and the warmth of the day had faded, Rosa returned to Hall 203 with her cleaning cart. Her shift was nearly over, but she lingered outside the door longer than usual. Her hand hovered over the handle. She looked both ways down the corridor, then entered slowly, like someone stepping into an old house filled with the echoes of her youth. The equation was still on the board. More than that, it was beckoning her. Not like a taunt, but like a plea, an unsolved prayer left unfinished by hands less certain than hers. She didn't clean the board that night. She left it as it was and walked home through the snow, her boots squeaking on the sidewalk. Her apartment was warm, filled with books and silence. She turned on the kettle, then pulled a yellowing binder from the shelf. It creaked as she opened it. Decades of notes, diagrams, and theories handwritten in ink and pencil. She flipped through pages she hadn't touched in years, running her fingers across her own handwriting. She slept poorly that night, dreams tumbling into one another, chalkboards, conference rooms, her mother's voice, her husband's coughing, her own hand rising in a lecture hall ignored. The next morning, Rosa arrived even earlier than usual. The halls were still in darkness. Her keys turned the locks with the same soft click, but there was a new energy in her step, like a current moving beneath the surface. She brought no mop this time. Just a rag, a thermos of tea, and a small piece of chalk she had saved from years ago. No one was watching. No one ever was at that hour. She stepped into Lecture Hall 203 and walked up to the board. The challenge still stood, untouched, unsolved. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she lifted the chalk and began to write. At first, she paused after each symbol, testing herself. But slowly, the rhythm returned. Her brain began to dance with the equations. Her hand remembered movements she hadn't made in decades. Her mind didn't resist, it leapt. The solution poured out of her like breath. She annotated each step, ensured each justification was flawless. She checked herself twice, then 3 times. 20 minutes passed, then 30. She finished the last step and circled the final answer with a quiet exhale. Her legs ached. Her hand was stained with dust. But her eyes shone. She stepped back to admire the board. It was perfect. She knew it in her bones. Then the moment passed. She set the chalk down gently, picked up her rag, and left. When students arrived for the morning lecture, they found the problem solved. Each step clean and concise, the logic impeccable. At first, they thought it was a prank. Then came confusion. Some assumed Benton had written the solution himself. Others whispered about the rumor from yesterday. Someone had solved the previous equation, too, just as mysteriously. By the time Professor Benton arrived, the room was already abuzz. He froze at the door, his eyes narrowing at the chalkboard. He read through it slowly, his lips moving as he processed each line. His expression shifted, from irritation to disbelief, then something else. His chalk dropped into the tray. "Who did this?" he asked. No one answered. Students looked around, as confused as he was. No one claimed it. He stood for a moment, silent, then erased the board without a word and began his lecture. But the story didn't end there. That evening, one student, Ramon Torres, decided to act. A sophomore in applied mathematics, he had been in the back of the lecture hall when the second solution appeared, the same way he had been when the first did. Something about the timing, the silence, the invisibility of it all gnawed at him. He approached his roommate, a computer science major, and borrowed a spare webcam. The next night, he returned to Hall 203 and hid the device on a ledge near the ceiling, pointing it toward the board. "No one needs to know," he said, mostly to himself. The camera began recording just after midnight. The next morning, the equation had changed again. Not only had it been expanded upon, but a refinement had been made to the previous step, something even more elegant than before. Ramon didn't go to class. He rushed back to his dorm, plugged the camera into his laptop, and fast-forwarded through hours of darkness. Then he saw her, a lone figure, elderly, dressed in a janitor's uniform, Rosa. She walked in, looked around, pulled the chalk from her pocket, and began to write. His mouth opened. He froze the frame, rewound, watched again. There she was, old, slow-moving, deliberate, but precise, like a woman who had waited 40 years to exhale. That night, Ramon uploaded the footage anonymously to the student server. He didn't add music, no subtitles, just the truth, unfiltered. By morning, everyone on campus had seen it. The whispers grew louder. A janitor, an old black woman, solving equations that even Benton himself hesitated to touch. By midday, students were gathered in the halls discussing it. Faculty began asking questions. Some dismissed it as doctored. Others demanded answers. No one had a name. No one knew who she was. But the board did. And it remembered everything. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere at Harvard had shifted. Something intangible had taken root in the air, a quiet charge like the hush before a storm. The hallways buzzed with conversations that stopped abruptly when certain professors passed by. Students huddled in groups near bulletin boards and stairwells, whispering with the kind of urgency usually reserved for final exam rumors or campus scandals. And all of it revolved around one video, silent, grainy, unedited, recorded in the dead of night. It had no music, no narrative, just a still camera aimed at the chalkboard in Lecture Hall 203, and a woman in a gray uniform slowly solving a problem no one else could. Her posture was bent. Her hand trembled slightly at first, but her movements became more fluid, more confident, as the symbols appeared like a cascade of thought made visible. There was no drama, no sudden revelation, only quiet certainty. The video ended with her stepping back, examining her work, and leaving without a glance back. By noon, over 400 students had seen it. By evening, it had been reposted to 2 university Reddit threads, a student-run Instagram page, and one particularly enthusiastic freshman's YouTube channel, complete with the dramatic caption, "Harvard Janitor Solves Impossible Equation, Genius in Disguise." Within 24 hours, it reached 10,000 views, but no one knew her name. In the faculty lounge of the mathematics department, the professors gathered with furrowed brows and low voices. Benton had been noticeably silent since the incident. He denied responsibility for the video, dismissed the solution as an unauthorized intervention, and claimed that someone had broken university protocol. Yet there was a tremor in his voice now when he spoke in meetings, a small fissure in the armor of his confidence. Others were more curious than defensive. A younger assistant professor suggested that it might be a publicity stunt, a rogue doctoral candidate making a statement. Another wondered aloud if it was AI-generated, until someone reminded him that chalk doesn't respond to code. A third mentioned the woman's gait, her age, her uniform. It couldn't be real, someone said. It didn't make sense. Down in the facilities office, Rosa sat quietly at a metal desk while her supervisor, Mr. Chalmers, shifted uneasily behind a stack of maintenance requests. He was a thin, balding man in his late 40s, always dressed in pressed khakis and a short-sleeved shirt, the kind who followed rules with devout precision. He'd called her in after being encouraged by someone from administration to do so. "I need to ask you something, Rosa," he began, tapping the table with a plastic pen. "Some stuff's been going around. Videos from the lecture hall. You've been writing on the boards." Rosa didn't answer right away. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. She studied the wall clock above his shoulder. It ticked with a metronome's indifference. "They asked me to find out," he continued, uncomfortable now. It's not part of your duties, you know. You're not faculty, and it's causing a bit of a stir." She finally nodded, but not in affirmation or denial. It was more of a gesture of understanding. Then she stood, gently thanked him, and left without waiting to be dismissed. Mr. Chalmers let her go. He didn't press. He didn't report anything. He just sat there, watching the door after it closed, as if it might open again with a better explanation. That evening, Rosa did not go into Lecture Hall 203. She walked past it slowly, her cart moving a bit more sluggishly than usual. The weight of the day had settled on her shoulders in a different way than mops or buckets ever had. She'd always known her silence was protection. It had shielded her from scrutiny, from judgment, from pity. Now the silence was breaking, and with it came a sharp vulnerability she had not felt in years. In her apartment that night, she pulled out a binder she hadn't opened in over a decade. Inside were the last pages of her doctoral work, notes scrawled in the margins, critiques from her advisor, diagrams drawn with precise hands and restless nights. She ran a fingertip over her name on the cover. Rosa Lee Walker, Ph.D. in Applied Mathematics, University of Michigan, 1982. There had been a time when that name meant something, when it opened doors, when it commanded respect in rooms with chalk dust and caffeine, where ideas were currency and proofs were passports. But that time had passed, or so she thought. The next day, the video reached the inbox of Harvard's Assistant Dean for Academic Affairs. Within hours, an internal email was sent to the Office of Conduct and Policy Review, which then forwarded it to the Division of Faculty Services. By mid-afternoon, the head of facilities was contacted, and Rosa was summoned once more. This time not by Mr. Chalmers, but by a university administrator named Miss Sloan. Miss Sloan's office was on the 4th floor of a building Rosa had cleaned many times. She sat at a broad glass desk, behind which books were arranged like trophies on color-coded shelves. She wore a burgundy blouse and a narrow expression. "We're concerned," Miss Sloan began, not looking up from the printed transcript of the video's Reddit thread. "The board you wrote on is reserved for faculty instruction. Unauthorized use of university academic space constitutes a violation of protocol." Rosa sat straight in the wooden chair. Her hands were still, but her eyes were not. "This has been viewed by thousands of people," Miss Sloan continued. "There are reputational concerns. The mathematics department is requesting clarity." She paused, waiting. "I didn't mean no harm," Rosa said quietly. The cadence of her southern drawl softened but intact. Miss Sloan blinked, taken aback slightly by the sound of her voice. She'd assumed the woman wouldn't speak. "You're not authorized to engage with academic material," she repeated. "Especially not in a way that suggests representation of the department. Do you understand that?" Rosa nodded. "We'll be issuing a formal notice," Miss Sloan added. "This may affect your position." Rosa said nothing. She did not argue. She did not plead. She simply stood, nodded again, and left. That night, she did go back to Hall 203. Not to write, but to clean. The board had been erased. The room was quiet. Her hands moved in practiced rhythm across the surfaces, wiping away smudges, emptying trash bins, aligning chairs. She stopped at the chalkboard, looked at it, and then turned away. Outside, a thin snow had begun to fall. Meanwhile, the student body had not remained silent. A petition had begun circulating, launched by a small group of undergraduates in the mathematics department, demanding the university acknowledge the unknown woman's contribution and rescind any disciplinary actions. It had 300 signatures by nightfall. By the next morning, it had 800. The Harvard Crimson published a short editorial titled "The Janitor Who Outsmarted the Board." It raised questions the administration was not ready to answer. Across campus, someone made flyers with stills from the video, and the words, "Who is she?" printed in bold red. By Monday, the story reached national news outlets. The Washington Post ran a piece titled, Hidden Genius, Harvard's Anonymous Mathematician. CNN requested comment. BuzzFeed called her the Chalkboard Queen. A 10-minute YouTube essay speculated that she was a former professor fired decades ago. Another suggested she was an undiscovered prodigy. No one got it quite right. But no one stopped watching. That week, Professor Benton received a formal request from the Office of Public Affairs to explain his role. He responded curtly, but inside he was unraveling. Not just because his authority had been questioned, but because the solution she'd written, her proof, was not just correct. It was elegant, breathtaking, subtle in a way he had never achieved. And the refinements? He hadn't even considered them. He spent a night in his office with the door locked, reworking her equations on his own, trying to see how she had done it. At some point, long past midnight, he stopped and stared at the board, not at the numbers, at the memory of her, the way she moved, the steadiness of her hand. He remembered her face now, not just in the video, but in the room. All these years, and he'd never seen her, but she had been there. The next morning, he walked into his classroom to find silence. No one looked at him the same. He began his lecture, but something in his voice had changed, and when he turned to write on the board, he paused, as if expecting someone else to be standing there, chalk already in hand. But the room was empty, and her name, still, was nowhere to be found. Over the course of 3 days, the story consumed the campus. What had begun as a whisper, a midnight video uploaded without commentary, now roared through the lecture halls and cafeterias, across faculty lounges and student dormitories. The janitor, the board, the proof. Her image, stooped in the gray uniform with chalk in hand, had become an icon. Students printed stickers with her silhouette and stuck them to laptops. Graffiti began appearing in bathroom stalls. She solved it. You erased it. The university's administration, which had initially treated the incident as a nuisance, found itself caught in a growing firestorm. The Office of Strategic Communications issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging the public interest in a recent video circulating online and assured that the matter was being reviewed internally. But no one was satisfied. Comment sections filled with derision. Tweets mocked the institution's evasiveness. Editorials asked harder questions. What does it say about Harvard that a mathematical genius went unnoticed for over a decade because she carried a mop? National news picked it up next. A segment on CNN featured a side-by-side image. On the left, Rosa writing on the chalkboard. On the right, Professor Benton watching it play in silence from his office. His expression, caught on camera, was unreadable. But to the public, it looked like shame. Rosa didn't own a television. She had never used Twitter, but she heard. In the stairwells where students whispered her name. In the janitorial locker room where co-workers stared at her longer than usual. In the way the campus police officer at the gates nodded to her. Not the usual hurried, distracted nod, but a slow, deliberate one that meant, I saw it. The silence around her was different now. It was loaded, volatile. She felt visible for the first time in years, and it terrified her. She walked to work as she always had, before the sun rose, wrapped in a navy coat, her scarf pulled high on her neck. The cold stung, but she welcomed it. It grounded her. The snow had melted into slick patches of ice, and students skidded on their way to morning classes, clutching coffees and backpacks, many of them staring at their phones. Some of them looked up when they passed her. A few slowed. One young woman, no older than 20, actually stopped and said, "Thank you." Rosa blinked. She nodded gently. The girl walked off, looking back once over her shoulder. Rosa continued on. That afternoon, she received an envelope in her locker. Inside was a single-page letter bearing the seal of the university and the signature of an administrator she had never met. The language was clinical. Due to a violation of university policy, her employment was being formally reviewed. Effective immediately, she was placed on administrative leave without pay, pending the further investigation. No explanation. No meeting. Just paper. She read it twice, then folded it once and put it in her pocket. She did not cry. She did not march to any office. She finished her shift. At home, the apartment was quiet as always. She boiled water for tea, poured it into a chipped cup, and sat in the same chair she always did near the window. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again in soft spirals. The binder lay on the kitchen table, still open to her old doctoral notes. She hadn't touched it since the day she'd written the second proof. Now, slowly, she reached forward and flipped the pages. These were not the scribblings of a hobbyist. They were the disciplined markings of a working mind, a scholar's mind. Diagrams of non-linear interactions, marginal notes in the edges about quantum limits and boundary predictions. Her fingers rested on a formula she'd half-developed in 1998. She had never published it. No one had seen it. At that moment, she didn't feel like a janitor or a genius. She just felt alone. The next morning, she stayed home for the first time in years. In Lecture Hall 203, Professor Benton began his lecture to a room that seemed colder than usual. Students sat with their arms crossed, many of them quiet, watching him more than they watched the board. He knew why. He tried to focus, tried to deliver his lecture with the precision he was known for, but something was wrong. Every time he lifted the chalk, he saw her hand instead of his. Every time he paced, he remembered the grainy video. And when he turned to speak, his voice faltered, not from guilt exactly, but from dissonance, from knowing that he had overlooked something important. Someone. After class, a group of students gathered outside the lecture hall. Some held signs. Nothing dramatic, just her silhouette again with the words, "Let her teach." Others stood silently, arms linked. There was no shouting, no chanting, but their presence was undeniable. By noon, the petition had passed 5,000 signatures. It now included signatures from alumni, visiting scholars, and students from other universities. A PhD student from MIT had written an open letter calling Rosa a living refutation of the system's narrow vision of merit. A well-known mathematician from Stanford tweeted, "If she's who I think she is, I cited her in 1983. The administration convened an emergency meeting. Inside the boardroom on the top floor of University Hall, the deans, legal advisors, and senior faculty sat around a polished mahogany table. The mood was tense. At the head sat the university president, a man known for diplomacy and discretion, not decisiveness. "We have a problem," the dean of faculty began. "I'm aware," the president replied. "Her presence is becoming a symbol," added another. "And symbols are hard to contain. We've received media requests from the Times, NPR, and even a documentary proposal," said the director of communications. "We can't stay silent." "She violated policy," a senior advisor interjected. "We can't ignore that. If we let this go unpunished, it sets a precedent." "But what precedent?" asked the dean of diversity. "That brilliance deserves recognition even when it doesn't come with a title?" The room fell quiet. "We're being criticized for punishing someone for being extraordinary," the president said. "And not just any someone. A black woman, a janitor, at Harvard. A long silence followed. Finally, the director of human resources cleared his throat. We could offer a compromise, reinstate her, not as a faculty member, not yet, but in a transitional capacity. No, came a voice from the back. It was Benton. He had arrived late, asked to speak privately. She doesn't need a compromise, he said. She needs a classroom. Murmurs spread. The president raised a brow. And what makes you so sure? Someone challenged. Benton hesitated. He reached into his folder and removed 2 pages of calculations. Rosa's work, her proof, her annotations. He handed it forward. Because I couldn't have written this in 20 years. Because no one in my department could have. Because I've been teaching for decades, and I've never seen elegance like this from anyone. No one spoke. She taught me something, he added quietly, and I was the one pointing at her while mocking her existence. I owe her more than just a seat. We all do. The room stayed still for a long while. Later that night, Rosa received a knock on her apartment door. She opened it to find Benton standing there, awkward, underdressed for the cold, holding a folder. I came to apologize, he said, eyes lowered, and to offer you something. He extended the folder. She didn't take it. I saw the news, she said. I read your quote. It's not enough, he said. Not for what I said, not for what I missed. I should have seen you. Years ago. They stood in silence. Come back, he said finally. Not to clean, to teach, or at least to speak. There's a conference next month in Princeton. They want to hear you. They need to. Rosa's eyes narrowed. What do you need from me? Nothing, he said honestly. But they do. She looked at him long and hard, then finally stepped aside. Inside, over a cup of tea, she told him about her dissertation, about her mother's illness, about the husband who needed her, about the years of silence that became easier than trying to be seen. He listened. When he left, she didn't give him an answer. But 2 days later, she walked into University Hall in a long black coat and signed a document that reinstated her, not as a janitor, but as a guest lecturer, with an invitation to speak at the conference in Princeton. They called it a provisional position. Rosa called it a beginning, not the one she had hoped for all those years ago, but perhaps the one that finally belonged to her. And when she walked through campus the next morning, students parted to let her pass. Not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. Because for the first time, Harvard saw her, not as a uniform, not as a story, but as a mind. The first snowfall of February clung stubbornly to the stone edges of Harvard's buildings, softening their academic severity with a blanket of white. Rosa stood at the edge of Harvard Yard, watching as students hurried to their morning lectures, bundled in coats and scarves, their boots leaving temporary tracks on the slate paths. It had been a week since she signed the papers, a week since she had stood again in University Hall, this time not to clean its windows, but to confirm her return to the world she had long ago buried. The guest lecturer title felt like a borrowed coat. Unfamiliar, slightly too formal, but undeniably warm. Inside her apartment, the preparations had already begun. Books she hadn't opened in decades now lay scattered across the kitchen table. Highlighters, graph paper, sticky notes. At first, her hands had been tentative, hovering above old theorems like one might approach a childhood piano. But the instincts returned quickly, as if the ideas had never left, merely waited for permission to resurface. The email from the Princeton Mathematical Institute had come 3 days earlier. The tone was reverent but professional. The invitation was clear. Would Dr. Rosalie Walker consider speaking at the upcoming international conference on boundary structures and nonlinear systems? Her name would be printed on the schedule, on the program, in the abstracts. She would have 45 minutes in the main auditorium. There would be press, faculty, graduate students, Nobel laureates. But more than that, there would be a stage. And a chalkboard. She had read the email once, then again, and then quietly turned off the computer. Later, when she responded in the affirmative, she wrote only 2 words: "I accept." Benton had visited once more since then. He arrived with a stack of folders, printouts, references, and a not-so-subtle offer to help refine her talk. Rosa listened politely, thanked him for the materials, and sent him on his way with a polite but firm, "I'll handle it." He didn't argue. In truth, he was relieved. He had no interest in interfering. Watching her work was like watching someone tune an instrument only they could hear. The week before the conference, the Harvard Crimson ran a full-page profile titled "The Mind Behind the Mop." The photo showed Rosa seated at her kitchen table, back straight, glasses perched on her nose, papers fanned out before her. Her expression was focused, not posed. The reporter had been respectful, and Rosa had agreed to the interview only after much persuasion. In the article, she had spoken little of her past and less of the humiliation. Instead, she talked about patterns, about symmetry, about the stillness she found in equations when the rest of the world refused to be quiet. When the day of the conference arrived, Rosa rose before the sun. She dressed carefully, choosing a charcoal gray suit that had hung untouched in her closet for nearly 20 years. It still fit. Her scarf was navy with faint golden threads, and she tucked it gently beneath the lapels of her coat. She wore no jewelry. Her hair, silver and coiled, was pulled into a soft bun. Before leaving, she turned off the lamp above her desk and ran her fingers lightly across the last page of her handwritten outline. The train ride to Princeton was smooth, the snow melting into glistening puddles along the tracks. At the station, a car waited for her with a driver holding a placard that read, "Dr. Rosa L. Walker." She smiled at the sight, not because it surprised her, but because it didn't. Not anymore. The conference hall bustled with energy, a hum of expectation pulsing through its corridors. Posters of abstract models and theoretical frameworks lined the walls. Young researchers clustered near coffee urns, discussing string stability and data convergence in the tone of missionaries swapping scripture. Some recognized her. A few approached, tentatively, their voices respectful. "Dr. Walker," one said, a young woman with anxious eyes. "Your paper from '82, I read it in grad school. You changed the way I looked at multi-boundary integration." Rosa nodded. "You remembered the math," she said, "so I did my job." She was escorted backstage by a student volunteer with trembling hands. The room was warm, filled with the hum of microphones being tested and the soft static of projection screens coming to life. A glass of water waited at the podium. Chalk, real chalk, not markers or tablets, sat on the small ledge beneath the board. Rosa reached for a piece, feeling its familiar texture. Her fingers knew it like they knew rhythm. Then came the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to introduce a very special guest. Her presence today speaks not only to mathematical excellence but to the resilience of genius. Please welcome Dr. Rosa Lee Walker." As the applause rose, Rosa walked calmly to the stage. She didn't hurry. She didn't stumble. Her steps were slow and sure, like someone who had walked this path in her dreams 1,000 times. The auditorium, packed to the last row, fell silent the moment she reached the podium. She turned to the chalkboard and wrote a single line. "Elegance is not optional in mathematics. It's the goal." Then she turned back to the audience. 15 years ago, I stopped writing," she began, "but I didn't stop thinking, because thought, well, it doesn't require permission." She spoke not of her dismissal, not of the indignity, not of the mop. She spoke of nonlinear systems and layered convergence, of boundary structures and their symmetries. She spoke with clarity, with grace, and with the kind of command that only comes from decades of silence turned inward, honed, and now finally set free. Her hand moved swiftly across the board, not rushed but rhythmic, each line of the proof unfolding like a stanza of poetry. She paused only to look back at the room, to ensure they were following. They were. 45 minutes passed like 10. When she stepped back from the final line of her solution, a hush held the room. Then came the sound. First, a few hands clapping, then more, and then the entire auditorium stood in ovation, their applause thunderous. Rosa stood still, chalk in hand, then gave a single nod. Afterward, the questions came like rain. A physicist from Caltech asked about the potential applications of her model to gravitational field interactions. A German scholar inquired about her views on multi-domain diffusion limits. She answered each with measured precision, sometimes pushing her glasses up her nose with her pinky, her voice calm and exact. When it was over, Rosa returned to her seat in the front row. Her hands trembled only slightly now, not from fear, but from relief. At Harvard, news of the lecture reached campus before Rosa did. The conference had been live-streamed. Students gathered in dining halls and lounges to watch. Faculty followed along on university laptops. And when the ovation erupted on screen, some rose from their chairs without realizing it. That night, the university president called Benton. His tone was clipped but controlled. "We've made a mistake," he said. "I know," Benton replied. "We'd like to offer her a formal appointment." "As what?" Benton asked. "As a lecturer, for now, but we'll review it, perhaps more." Benton didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply said, "It's about time." The next morning, Rosa received the official offer. She read it once, then placed it gently beside her tea. Her apartment was still quiet, still modest, still home, but something had shifted. Not in the furniture, not in the walls, in her. She walked to campus slowly. The students she passed didn't look through her anymore. They looked at her, not as a symbol, not as a miracle, as a teacher. And when she passed Lecture Hall 203, the door stood open. She paused just for a moment, then stepped inside. The board was empty, waiting. She reached for the chalk and wrote. On the first day of spring semester, the air in Cambridge held the sharpness of late winter, but there was something softer around the edges now, early sunlight glinting off the windows of University Hall, steam rising from coffee cups clasped in gloved hands, and a sense of quiet anticipation pulsing through Harvard Yard. Students filled the walkways like rivers converging, some unaware what was about to unfold in Lecture Hall 203, and others already lined up, backs pressed against the wall, hoping to claim a seat. The schedules said advanced topics in applied mathematics. But everyone knew who was teaching. Rosa stood before her mirror that morning with a steadiness that surprised even her. She wore a tailored black blazer, a crisp ivory blouse, and a navy skirt that fell past her knees. No makeup, no jewelry. Her only adornment was a simple silver pin shaped like a spiral, an old gift from a friend long gone. Her hair was pulled back into a neat twist. She looked dignified, calm, and exactly like herself. She had slept little the night before. Not from nerves, but from preparation. For hours she had walked through her outline, refining her language, thinking of which examples would sing, which analogies would resonate, which moments required silence more than speech. Teaching, she had remembered, was not a performance. It was a gift. The university had tried to place her in a larger lecture hall, anticipating overflow, but Rosa had declined. "We start where we began," she told the registrar, and so it was 203. The room where she had once wiped chalk from boards while being laughed at for existing. The room where her silence had been mistaken for ignorance. The room where everything changed. By the time she arrived, the hallway was full. Students stood shoulder to shoulder, some clutching notebooks, others simply wanting to see. Inside the room, every seat was taken. Dozens stood along the back wall and crouched in the aisles. A few faculty members, uncharacteristically early, occupied the corners. A local reporter had wedged himself into the back row. Rosa walked past them all with quiet composure, nodding to those who made space, smiling gently to those who murmured her name. When she reached the lectern, the room fell into silence. She looked out over the sea of faces, young, curious, some familiar, many not. She let the silence sit for a few seconds longer, not to command attention, but to acknowledge it. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice clear but soft. "My name is Dr. Rosa Walker." A ripple of warmth moved through the room. Some smiled. A few sat up straighter. No one spoke. "Most of you know who I am because of a video, or a lecture, or an article someone else wrote, but none of those things tell you who I was, or why I'm here now." She paused, let the weight settle. "I'm 74 years old," she continued, "and until 2 months ago I was your janitor." Not a sound. "I swept this floor. I emptied those bins. I cleaned the board you see behind me. And one afternoon, not so long ago, I was pointed at by a man standing here, this very spot, who told you that if you didn't work hard enough, you'd end up like me." The silence grew heavier, heads lowered. "And he was right," she said, "but not in the way he meant." A few students raised their eyes. "Because I am what happens when someone works hard, long, and without applause. When someone chooses duty over ambition, family over fame. I walked away from a career in mathematics, not because I failed, but because life called me in a different direction. I cared for people who could no longer care for themselves. And when that chapter ended, I came back to the only place I had ever belonged, this world of logic and structure and beauty." She turned to the chalkboard and began writing, the strokes smooth and purposeful. "What you'll learn in this course," she said, "is how to see what others miss. That's what mathematics is. Not just calculation, but perception, pattern, intuition." As she moved across the board, her teaching style became apparent. She didn't lecture from above. She didn't dominate the room with certainty. She invited them in, asked questions not to test, but to discover. When students offered hesitant answers, she built on them, shaped them into truth. When they were wrong, she thanked them for trying. She used metaphors rooted in everyday life: coiled hoses, windows frosting in winter, the angles of rooftops in the snow. 1 hour turned to 2. No one left. Outside, a group of students sat in the hallway with their backs against the wall, earbuds dangling from one ear, listening to a live audio feed one of their friends had set up from inside. A teaching assistant from another department joined them. By the end of the lecture, the hallway was full. When Rosa finished the session, she set her chalk down and stepped back. There was no applause, not because the students weren't moved, but because they knew it would break the moment. She smiled and dismissed the class. As students filtered out, many lingered, coming forward not with questions about math, but with quiet thank yous. Some didn't speak at all. They just nodded, eyes wet. Rosa acknowledged them all. She stayed in the room until the last student left, then erased the board herself. Later that day, in the administrative wing, the president of the university held a private meeting with the dean of faculty. A final decision had been reached. "She's beyond titles now," the dean said. "We all know that." The president agreed. "But we'll give her one anyway." Rosa was formally appointed to the position of senior lecturer in applied mathematics. The contract arrived by courier the next morning. She signed it without ceremony, then went back to reading through a paper by a student who had handed it to her shyly after class. Within weeks, Rosa's lectures became legendary. Students from other departments audited the course without credit. Requests poured in from universities across the country. She received invitations to speak in Berlin, in Kyoto, in Cape Town. She declined them all for the time being. "Let me settle," she said. One afternoon, Benton appeared in the doorway of Lecture Hall 203. Rosa looked up from the chalkboard and nodded. He took a seat in the second row, not in the shadows, not in the back. When she asked a question, he raised his hand. After class, he approached her. "That boundary condition you used, could you walk me through your reasoning?" Rosa smiled, not unkindly. "Of course, Professor." In the days that followed, she returned to her apartment each evening with a satchel full of notebooks, drafts, and student essays. She worked late into the night, reviewing, annotating, remembering what it meant to be needed for one's mind. The apartment hadn't changed, but she had. Even her neighbors noticed. The way she stood a little straighter now, the way her voice had acquired a calm certainty. On one particular evening, after a long day of office hours, Rosa walked the path back through Harvard Yard alone. The sun had just dipped below the trees, casting the lawn in the golden shadow. Students still milled about, laughter echoing through the open spaces. She paused in front of Maxwell Hall and looked up at its old brick facade. Inside, she stepped into the corridor where it had all begun. The bulletin board still held flyers for study groups, fellowship applications, and lost gloves. But tucked among them was something else. A photo of her, chalk in hand, captured from the now legendary video. Below it, someone had written in block letters, "It's never too late to be seen." Rosa looked at it for a long time. Then she turned and continued down the hall toward her office. Her office. A small room tucked near the back of the building, window facing west, bookshelves half filled, a single-frame certificate above the desk. Not her degree, but a letter of thanks from a student who had failed every other math course until now. She set her satchel on the desk and looked around. She belonged here, not because someone said so, but because she had always belonged. That night, she stayed late, writing in chalk once again, not on the lecture board, but on a smaller wall in her office, sketching ideas for a paper she would submit in the fall. Her own ideas, her own voice. At 74, Rosa Lee Walker was just getting started, and this time no one could erase her. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our next video